the vote in Abkhazia was dubbed a sham by my guest today, who called it a violation of Georgia's national sovereignty. President Salome Zurabishvili, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Euronews today. The Abkhazia is a contentious topic in your country. The breakaway region...
It's not contentious, it's an occupied territory.
...is internationally recognized as part of Georgia, but there are certain nations, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, but also Syria and, of course, Russia, who see it as an independent state. This is, of course, an issue. This region, but also South Ossetia, are central issues in your relations with a very powerful neighbor, Russia. It's been now over 10 years since the war between the two countries, a brief but costly war. Can you tell us more about this election and also how you deal with these two contested regions?
Well, this so-called election, since we certainly do not recognize elections happening today under these conditions, but I'm convinced that one very close day there will be elections all over the territory of Georgia where the citizens, our citizens that are living in Abkhazia, will be able to participate in a much freer way to elections and determine the future of their region within Georgia.
You once called it a tragedy, a national tragedy, a tragedy that you're still living today, the fact that these two regions are contested.
That's what is very interesting, I think, and has to be underlined, that it's a human tragedy for the people that are living there because they are not allowed to have access to their language, to their identity is really threatened. There is a policy of Russification, so it's a very difficult situation. It's a difficult situation also on the occupying line for the villagers that are living there and sometimes are abducted. So it's a very tense situation. But at the same time, and that is what is important, Georgia has managed to continue its path towards Europe, its economic development, its democratic development. And I think that if the aim, and I think that was the aim of this war and then of the occupation, is to prevent Georgia from going in the direction, the Western direction that it has chosen, then we are winning that.
I want to talk about Europe in a second, but I want to ask you first, how complicated is it for you to lead a relatively small country when you have a neighbor with such big ambitions? And have you ever met the Russian president, Vladimir Putin?
No,
are you in contact with him?
You know that we do not have diplomatic relations since the war, because of the war and because of the occupied territories. And I've said many times that for us to have some forms of contacts, renewed contacts, we would need to have a clear sign that there is a change in the attitude of Russia with the small neighbor that we are, and the recognition that the relationship with a neighbor cannot happen in a forceful way. So when we see clear signs in that direction, I'm sure that we will be ready in the future for that dialogue. I'm sure that the situations will change. For the time being, is it difficult to be the president of such a country? It's a country that has 27 centuries of experience of having resisted all kinds of empires, almost all of them, of having parts of its territories at different times of history occupied by different empires. And we have survived all of that, so I'm sure we will survive. I'm sure that we'll continue moving towards Europe and within Europe, and we have gone a long way. One thing that for me is very important is that 15 years ago, nobody would have predicted that Georgia would first be in the neighborhood policy, second would be a partner in the partnership of the European Union. Nobody would have predicted that would become an associate member, that we would have visa-free regime, free trade, all of that. Everybody would have said impossible. So I think it is possible, and that's why it makes being a president of that country challenging, but very optimistic.
You also said that your election means that Georgia wants to move towards Europe. You are a European. You were born and raised here in Paris. Some 80% of the population, according to recent polls, want to be part of Europe. In an era of Brexit, Why do you think that is? When we have been talking here in Europe about this very contentious divorce, why does Georgia want to be part of the bloc?
Well, first I have to say and underline that I was elected not despite the fact that I had been French before and that I am a European, but because of that. And it's something that is very deeply entrenched in the Georgian mind and mentality, that Georgians feel that they are Europeans. It's not something that they are striving for. They are European. They are also very optimistic about Europe because they think that European attraction is something that has no alternative, which is something that from the inside sometimes Europeans do not see. But I'm telling Europeans, if you want to imagine what it could be if Europe ceased to exist and we would go back to the situation ante, then you would certainly realize that this is a nightmare. So Europe is a very important construction, a very successful construction, even if it has times of crisis. And one very, I think, interesting principle is that all the progress of Europe have been made because of crisis. Again, not despite crisis, but because of crisis. And as a result of crisis. So this one, I think the Brexit is certainly a very big challenge, but I'm sure that it will give way to new opportunities, to new obligations of Europe to reform itself. And as being optimist, I'm sure it will open new doors for us.
And is that something that you're watching closely, very briefly?
Very
Brexit
closely.
And the movement here in Europe, its crises, but also its opportunities. Is that something that Georgia continues to aim and watch closely?
We need to continue the movement that has been the one I described until now, and we will continue that movement, and to have these very clear progresses towards Europe. Within Europe, we need to know exactly where we put our feet in the new context of Europe. So we have to know it very well and be very realistic and very ambitious at the same time.
President Salome Zurabishvili, thank you very much for speaking to us here in the Global Conversation on Euronews.
Thank you.